The long and grinding war in Ukraine has just entered a new, high-stakes phase. On Monday, July 28, 2025, US President Donald Trump made a dramatic announcement, one that could change the course of the conflict. He significantly shortened the time Russia has to agree to a ceasefire. What was once a 50-day window for negotiations has now been reduced to a mere 10 or 12 days. This sudden change puts immense pressure on Moscow, signaling that Washington's patience is wearing thin. The world is watching to see if this bold move will bring peace or push the conflict into even more dangerous territory. President Trump's frustration was clear. He spoke about the human cost of the ongoing violence, the lives lost with each passing day. "I'm not so interested in talking anymore," he stated, explaining his decision. The president pointed to the nightly missile attacks, the destruction of towns, and the constant fear that civilians live with. The original 50-day deadline, established earlier in July, was meant to give diplomacy a chance. But with each new report of casualties, the American administration felt that a more urgent approach was needed. The message is simple: the talking must stop and the killing must end. The initial ultimatum came with a serious threat of new economic penalties. These weren't just ordinary sanctions. The US warned of secondary sanctions, which would punish other countries for doing business with Russia. This is a powerful economic weapon designed to isolate Moscow completely. Now, with the deadline cut to less than 2 weeks, that threat looms much larger and much closer. The intention is to force President Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table by making the economic pain of continuing the war unbearable. It is a high-risk strategy, but one the White House believes is necessary. The core demand from the United States and its ally Ukraine is straightforward: a complete and immediate ceasefire. They believe that before any meaningful peace talks can begin, the guns must fall silent. This silence for talks approach is seen as the essential first step to building trust and saving lives. Without a ceasefire, any discussion about long-term solutions seems impossible. The new shorter deadline is designed to force this very issue, to make a pause in the fighting the absolute priority before any other conditions are even considered by the international community. For Ukraine, a nation that has endured years of brutal warfare, President Trump's announcement was a welcome sign. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky quickly responded to the news, expressing his gratitude on the social media platform X. He called the American president's position a clear stance and expressed determination, noting that it came at exactly the right time. Zelensky thanked President Trump for his deep focus on saving human lives and his commitment to stopping what he called a horrible war. For a country under constant attack, this strong support from a key ally brings a renewed sense of hope. This sentiment was echoed by those closest to the Ukrainian leader. Andriy Yermak, President Zelensky's chief of staff, offered a blunt assessment of the situation. He stated that Russian President Vladimir Putin only understands strength, and he felt that this message had now been delivered clearly and loudly. This perspective highlights the Ukrainian belief that diplomatic niceties alone will not work with Moscow. They feel that only a firm, unyielding position, backed by credible threats, can force Russia to change its course. The ultimatum is seen not as an aggression, but as the necessary language to achieve peace. The hope for a ceasefire is made more urgent by the grim reality on the ground. The violence has not paused while diplomats talk. In just the past 24 hours, President Zelensky reported that Russian strikes have killed 22 people across his country. Each day brings new reports of missiles hitting civilian areas, turning homes into rubble and lives into statistics. This relentless barrage underscores why Ukraine is so desperate for the fighting to stop. The new deadline for them is not a political game. It is a potential lifeline for a nation bleeding every single day. One of the most horrific recent attacks occurred in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. According to Ukraine's Justice Ministry, a Russian airstrike hit a correctional facility, a place far from the front lines of military engagement. The attack killed at least 17 people and left another 42 wounded. Andriy Yermak immediately labeled this devastating event as another war crime, a deliberate targeting of a vulnerable population. Incidents like this harden Ukraine's resolve and fuel its plea to the world: the violence must be stopped now, without any further delay or preconditions from the aggressor. Russia's reaction to the new shortened deadline has been a mixture of official caution and defiant rhetoric. On Tuesday, July 29th, the Kremlin's official spokesperson Dmitry Peskov acknowledged that Moscow had seen President Trump's statement. However, When pressed for a reaction, he chose his words very carefully, stating that he would like to avoid any assessments for the time being. This non-committal response is typical of the Kremlin's public strategy. It allows them to keep their options open while they decide how to proceed, avoiding any immediate escalation or show of weakness in the face of the American ultimatum. However, other powerful figures in Russia were far less reserved. Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council and a former president, offered a much harsher take. He described the new deadline not as a step toward peace, but as a dangerous escalation. In a fiery statement, he went even further, calling it a step towards war with his own country, a thinly veiled reference to the United States. This kind of language is meant to signal that Russia will not be bullied and that it views the ultimatum as a direct threat, potentially justifying a more aggressive response of its own. Russia's position on what it would take to end the war has remained largely unchanged. Moscow insists that Ukraine must make significant concessions before any real peace negotiations can even begin. The Kremlin's list of demands is long and includes media group, stack of formal documents on Kremlin desk, Russian official reviewing list of demands, close-up of official papers, at distribute_equally, the complete demilitarization of Ukraine, meaning its military forces would have to be dismantled. Russia also demands that Ukrainian troops withdraw from key frontline regions, effectively ceding territory that Russia has occupied. This fundamental disagreement over who should act first remains the central obstacle to finding a peaceful resolution. Furthermore, a core Russian demand is a legally binding commitment that Ukraine will never join the NATO military alliance. Moscow has long viewed NATO's eastward expansion as a direct threat to its national security, and this issue was a key factor leading up to the invasion. Russia wants to ensure that Ukraine remains a neutral buffer state between it and the West. Until Ukraine agrees to abandon its NATO ambitions, Russia has indicated that it is not prepared to stop the fighting. This clash of non-negotiable demands puts the two sides at a seemingly unbreakable impasse. As the new 10 to 12-day clock ticks down, the world is left with a profound and unsettling question: what happens next? The path forward is shrouded in uncertainty. On one hand, the intense pressure from the United States, backed by the threat of crippling economic sanctions, could be enough to force Russia to agree to a ceasefire. This would be a monumental breakthrough, potentially paving the way for the first real peace negotiations in months. It could be the moment that finally halts the bloodshed and allows a process of de-escalation to begin, saving countless lives. On the other hand, the ultimatum could backfire spectacularly. Russia might see the shortened deadline as an act of desperation or an unacceptable insult to its sovereignty. President Putin could decide to call what he perceives as a bluff, choosing to escalate the conflict rather than submit to American demands. This could lead to more intense fighting in Ukraine or even new and more dangerous forms of confrontation between Russia and the West. The risk of miscalculation is incredibly high, and the consequences of such a mistake would be felt across the entire globe. The immediate future will likely be defined by a flurry of diplomatic activity behind the scenes, even as both sides maintain their public posturing. Allies of both the US and Russia will be working to gauge the seriousness of the threats and opportunities. We will be watching for any subtle shifts in language from the Kremlin or any signs of movement on the battlefield. At the same time, the nightly exchange of fire continues. Russia's defense ministry claimed it shot down 74 Ukrainian drones overnight, while Ukraine reported intercepting dozens of Russian drones and missiles aimed at its cities. Ultimately, the possibility of peace rests on whether a path can be found that allows both sides to step back without feeling defeated. Can a ceasefire be framed in a way that Russia does not see as a surrender and Ukraine does not see as a betrayal? The next few days will be critical. The world holds its breath, hoping for a breakthrough but bracing for the possibility of a darker chapter in this already tragic war. The fate of millions hangs in the balance, dependent on the decisions that will be made in Washington, Kiev, and Moscow.